The rain had already begun its slow, relentless tapping on the windshield by the time I cut the ignition, and the sound carried a rhythm that felt less like weather and more like a countdown, a warning from the sky itself that I had no business being here. But when you hunt what I hunt, warnings stop mattering after the first few years. And besides, I had a contract to fulfill. One that was already written in the blood and fear of a missing deputy whose last call came from these woods. My name is Ryan Gallagher, and if you've never heard of me, that's intentional. Monster hunters don't advertise, we don't carry business cards, and we certainly don't show up on payroll, because the moment the world realizes what slithers and lurches just outside its narrow cone of comfort, it collapses. Still, those in the know dial my number when the rules of nature bend and the forest starts writing its own laws again. Sheffield Preserve was breathing strangely tonight, each tree leaning inward as if conspiring, branches twitching not with the wind but with thought. And I knew before I even stepped out of the car that I would have to lean on the rules if I wanted to come back alive. Rule 1. If the trees fall silent, hum a tune you learned before you were 10, because childhood is the only thing the forest still respects. I whispered the old dog song under my breath, offbeat claps include, and felt the atmosphere hesitate, like an unseen hand had lifted slightly off my throat. Rule 2. When you see a lantern between the pines, count to 13 before you look directly, because what waits at 12 isn't human anymore. Rule 3. Keep iron on your left, salt on your right, because imbalance is permission. Rule 4. Never name an animal until it survives the first night, because if it answers early, it isn't yours. Rule 5. If you find a door frame standing alone, walk around it clockwise once, never step through, because time here keeps receipts. Rule 6. When you hear your name called from behind, face it with a mirror, because debt collectors from the forest don't take money. Rule 7. If dawn comes and your shadow is gone, don't call for it, because the forest will send company, and trust me, you don't want that kind of companionship. I repeat them like scripture because repetition makes them real, and real is the only shield I have when curiosity comes clawing. My boots sank into the mud as I moved forward, every step deliberate, slow enough to convince whatever was watching that I was the patient one, not it. Though patience is a lie I tell the forest because it loves liars more than quitters. I passed the old oak boundary marker, 7 rested nails hammered in a vertical line, twine still looped around the middle like a warning nobody bothers to understand anymore, and pressed my palm to the top nail, counting each one until my skin touched the 7th, the number that binds bargains here. The air changed instantly, colder, hungrier, like the woods had just noticed my heartbeat and was calculating its rhythm. Some hunters swagger, but swagger doesn't keep your bones inside your skin. What does is humility mixed with the stubborn kind of curiosity that refuses to die. The same curiosity that made me step past the sign that read "Trail closed due to flooding" because I knew flooding wasn't the real reason. A flashlight beam would have betrayed me, so I relied on the low gray glow of storm clouds and memory of the path from past hunts, moving deeper until even the drizzle felt muffled. That's when I realized it. The woods were holding their breath. No frogs, no owls, no skitter of mice under leaves. Just me, just the weight of the storm. My lips moved without thinking, humming that silly childhood tune, and I'll be damned if the rhythm didn't bounce back at me from the trees, echoing faintly like a second voice had decided to join in. I froze, the iron heavy against my left hip, the salt pouch rattling on my right, and in that suspended silence, I understood the first promise of the hunt. Whatever lived here knew me already, knew my name, and was only deciding whether I had the sense to play by the rules or break them.
The paper with the 7 rules was damp by the time I pulled it from my vest, the ink running just enough to make the words look alive, wriggling like worms across the page. But I read them anyway, because repetition is armor, and in this forest, armor is memory. If you forget, you die. I whispered each one again, Rule 1 through Rule 7, and tucked it back into the leather pouch at my chest, right against the heartbeat that never seems steady in this place. then adjusted my grip on the iron spike because the forest was clever enough to know when I needed to be reminded why I carried it. I moved deeper, the trees pressing closer with every step, as if they were narrowing the path not out of natural growth but intentional design. And though my boots sank into the sponge-soft mulch, I forced myself to keep walking slow and steady, never giving away the instinct to run, because the forest adores desperation and punishes it swiftly. The prints appeared first, deep, toe-first indentations in the soil, too long for human, too narrow for bear, each step deliberate as though the creature had been pacing itself, testing gravity. I knelt, pressing my fingers into the damp impression, and the warmth that lingered there set my stomach into a knot. Whatever made these tracks wasn't ahead of me. It was close, circling, maybe even behind me. Rule 6 scratched at the back of my mind. When you hear your name spoken from behind you, it's a debt collector. Face it with a mirror first. And I kept my hand near the compact mirror in my coat pocket, every nerve in me begging to check, begging to turn, but I resisted, because the forest feeds on impulse. I hummed again, louder this time, that silly dog song my father once sang on long car rides, each offbeat clap breaking the rhythm just enough to confuse the silence. And it worked, because the silence shivered. A low sound, too sharp to be wind, too heavy to be rain, threaded through the trees like something dragging claws against bark while pacing in a circle around me. "Ryan," a voice hissed, soft as mist, and I felt my chest seize. The name didn't echo like a human call. It folded into itself, bouncing in from every angle. And the forest waited to see if I would break Rule 6. I pulled the mirror free, raised it slowly over my shoulder without turning, and there in the cracked silver reflection was a figure holding a lantern between the pines. For a second my mind wanted to label it ranger, hunter, lost hiker, but the reflection blinked out of sequence, its smile stretching wider than the mouth allowed, and I knew immediately. Not a man, not a rescuer, but a collector. I whispered an apology under my breath, Rule 6 demanding an offering, so I tore a strip of cloth from my sleeve, cut a shallow line across my palm with the iron tip, and pressed the blood-wet fabric against the trunk of the nearest tree, saying, "For the debt of looking." The air sighed, heavy, and the reflection's smile faded. When I lowered the mirror, the lantern was still there, swaying between the pines, bright and human steady, and curiosity curled its claws around my ribs. Rule 2. Count to 13 before you look directly. I did. I counted slow, lips moving, and on 13, I dared to face the lantern straight on. A man stood beneath it now, tall, wearing a brimmed hat that shadowed his face, coattails dripping with rain that didn't touch me. "Cold night to be alone," he said, voice smooth like old radio static. I kept my left hip angled toward him, iron brushing my thigh, and answered with the same calmness I'd trained myself to wear like a mask. "Names?" I asked. "Names are for dawn," he said softly. The forest behind me shifted, branches cracking where nothing should move, and that's when the lantern dipped forward, inviting me closer. The man hummed the dog song back at me. Almost right, but the rhythm was wrong, the claps landing on the beat instead of off it, and the forest stilled, listening, waiting to see if I would correct him, waiting to see if I understood that timing was life and life was timing. My tongue felt heavy, but I clapped once, deliberately offbeat, and the lantern light flickered as though the forest itself had exhaled. The man's smile twitched, like skin stretched too thin over something that wasn't a face at all, and the lantern dimmed for the briefest moment before flaring again. "You don't chase lanterns," he whispered. I shadowed under the brim. "You let them chase you." And with that, the forest hummed the final note of my song back to me. Only this time, it wasn't me singing anymore. I don't scare easily, not after years of cataloging things the rest of the world refuses to name. But the moment the forest stole my tune and sang it back in my own voice, every hair on my arms rose and my instincts screamed to run. Except running in a place like this is the fastest way to die. So I stood still, breathing shallow, forcing my heartbeat into a rhythm that felt more like patience than panic, because patience is what predators respect. The lantern figure tilted his head, as if listening to some secret conversation in the soil, and then the flame sputtered, shrank, and winked out, leaving me staring at a patch of pine darkness, where a moment earlier there had been borrowed light. The silence after was heavier than any thunder,
but I moved forward anyway, boots crunching deliberately on wet pine needles, knowing full well the forest was measuring my resolve. That's when the footprints began again, deep impressions in the mud that hadn't been there moments before, each one warm to the touch when I crouched and pressed my fingers into it. Warmth that shouldn't exist in a storm like this unless the creature was close enough to see me even if I couldn't see it. The prints didn't lead ahead, though. They started at my feet, like something had decided to exist right where I stood and then walked away from me, toe first, dragging its heel through the muck, as if mocking human gait. Rule 3 tugged at me. Iron on the left, salt on the right. Balance, always balance. And I adjusted the pouches at my belt until the weight was even. Because if you're unbalanced here, the forest treats you like an unfinished equation, and unfinished equations get erased. I kept humming softly, testing the echo, and heard the faintest response in the distance. Off-key, but trying, like a child imitating its parent badly. My radio crackled in my pocket, and Leah's voice, distorted by static and storm, whispered, "Gallagher?" Thermal just blinked, cold spot reconvening, moving opposite your path. I exhaled slowly, scanning the trees, and the ferns to my left rippled with no wind, as if something huge had just glided through them. "You still tracking me?" I asked, voice low, controlled. "Barely," she admitted. "It's like it's choosing when to appear, as if heat itself is terrain and it knows how to walk the ridges." That description made my stomach tighten, because anything that treats physics like a playground is the kind of thing you don't ever want to see clearly. I pressed a chalk sigil into the mud, the shape of a smiling mouth, because that's what devours echoes, and placed a mirror shard upright against a root beside it. Old tricks, yes, but old tricks survive for a reason. Then I caught it. Movement at the corner of my vision. Tall, pale, folding itself around the bark of a pine. I didn't look directly. Rule 2 is still fresh in my bones. Instead, I angled the mirror toward it and saw the shape reflected there. Long-limbed, icicle white, face smooth but for a single jagged mouth line that stretched too wide, teeth flat like grinding stones. It moved in my reflection half a beat out of time, and that's when I knew Rule 6 was about to be tested. "Ryan," it said. Voice perfect, like my father calling me for dinner, like my mother scolding me softly, like a friend I buried years ago. My hands trembled, but I did not turn. I kept my eyes on the mirror, whispering the apology ritual and cutting another shallow line across my palm to offer 3 drops into the soil. "For the debt of listening," I muttered. Dropping the blood on the sigil, the thing's reflection snarled silently as the chalk lines hissed, smoke curling up into the storm. The forest pressed close, listening, and then the shape folded back into the shadows, leaving only the whisper of my name in the branches. I stayed still long enough for the rain to soak through my collar, long enough for the iron's weight to remind me which side was left and which side was right. When I finally moved again, the forest didn't echo me. It waited.
And in that waiting, I realized the worst truth of all. This wasn't a hunt anymore. This was a test, and I was the one being measured. The deeper I went, the more the forest felt less like a place and more like a mind. Every step I took sinking me into its thoughts, every breath I drew carrying a taste of something older than rot and fresher than rain, as though the woods themselves were exhaling through me. And then, as if cued by the very rhythm of my intrusion, I saw it again, the lantern. It burned between 2 white pines, glowing warm and steady, swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel, and if I hadn't memorized Rule 2, I might have let myself be lured into the comfort of that false glow. But rules exist for moments like this. I clenched my fists, counted slowly under my breath, 1, 2, 3, forcing my voice steady, even as every instinct screamed to run toward the light. By the time I hit 13, my eyes were locked on the figure holding the lantern, and my stomach turned with the realization that it was the same man from before, brimmed hat shadowing his face, coat dripping, except now his movements were sharper, more mechanical, as though the lantern itself was pulling his arm like a puppet string. "Cold night," he said again, the same words, the same cadence, only this time the voice had a faint delay, like it had been recorded and was struggling to play back in real time. I angled my hip so the iron spike rested heavy against my thigh, salt pouch brushing my right wrist, balance restored, and asked, "What do you want?" The figure tilted his head slowly as though confused by the question, then smiled in a way that stretched too far, teeth materializing in the dark where shadow should have hidden them. "Company," he whispered, and as he spoke, the trees behind me groaned, branches creaking as if something massive was shifting just out of sight. I didn't turn. Turning was what it wanted, but I hummed my song again, clapping once offbeat, and the lantern flame quivered. The man copied the tune back, but his clap landed perfectly on the beat, and the forest around me stilled, like an audience waiting for judgment. "Close," I muttered, but not close enough. My voice cracked on the last word, and immediately the lantern dimmed, sputtering as if offended. The air thickened, pressing down on my shoulders until it felt like a hand was forcing me to kneel. That's when I remembered Rule 4. Never name an animal until it survived the first night. And though no animal stood before me, the rule thrummed in my chest like a reminder that naming is binding, and binding is what this thing wanted. "Say my name," it whispered, teeth flashing in the lantern light. "You've already used it," I answered, forcing steel into my tone. The lantern's glow faltered again, the figure stiffening as if my refusal disrupted its rhythm. Behind me, a branch snapped, heavy, deliberate, and I knew something else had been listening, waiting for this exact exchange to end. The brimmed man tilted the lantern downward, placing it in the mud, and leaned close enough that I could see the shadow of his eyes, empty hollows where darkness swirled like smoke, and then he whispered, "You don't chase lanterns. You let them chase you." The light guttered out, plunging me into blackness, and from the void came the sound of footsteps, toe first, dragging through mud, circling closer with every heartbeat. My grip tightened on the iron spike, salt burning cold in my palm, and I realized that this wasn't just about following rules anymore. It was about proving I had the will to keep them when every part of me screamed to break them. And in that breathless silence, with the storm holding its fury just above the tree line, I understood that the lantern hadn't been a warning. It had been an invitation.
The footsteps circled tighter, slow, deliberate, as if whatever stalked me wanted me to hear each drag of mud, each press of weight into the sodden earth, a predator rehearsing its entrance before the curtain finally rose. And I forced myself to stay rooted in place, because every instinct screamed to bolt. But Rule 1 had already taught me that silence is the trap, and panic is the snare. So I hummed the dog tune again, clapping once on the offbeat, though this time my voice shook and the sound came out thin, and the forest seemed to grin at my faltering courage. Then, without warning, the mere snare I had laid earlier snapped with a sound like breaking ice, and a white blur lunged from the undergrowth straight into its reflection, thrashing against the invisible frame of glass and thread. For half a second I saw it clearly, tall as two men, skin the color of snow left too long in the shade, its face a smooth plate split by a jagged seam that tore itself open into a mouth, revealing teeth flat and wide like grinding stones, built not for cutting, but for erasing. It slammed against the mirror field, and every reflection of it blinked out of sequence, some snarling, some smiling, some just standing still and watching me. And my stomach turned, because I realized the thing didn't just want to kill me, it wanted to replace me, to peel me into versions until one of them fit. "Ryan," it crooned, and the sound used my father's voice,
gentle, warm, a memory I had no right to hear in this place. My hand trembled, but I forced myself to follow Rule 6, whispering the apology ritual, cutting my palm again and dripping 3 drops into the soil, saying, "For the debt of listening." The thing's many reflections hissed, recoiling slightly, and I threw a pauper coin into the mud as an offering, thumb worn from years of carrying, my last link to the man whose song I still sang. The forest accepted, just barely. The mirror shard shivered, the threads tightening until the thing howled like metal shearing, and then with a convulsion it folded sideways, slipping through the darkness like it had unzipped the world and stepped out of sight. My knees nearly buckled, but I held, breath ragged, iron spike heavy in my grip, salt pouch rattling at my hip, balance preserved. The silence that followed wasn't relief, though. It was expectation, the kind of pause a crowd gives before demanding an encore. And sure enough, the lantern flared to life again between the pines, only now the man who carried it was gone, replaced by the creature itself, wearing my silhouette like a borrowed coat, its featureless face tilted under the brim of a hat it hadn't been wearing before. The lantern swayed in its hand, mocking, daring me to chase. Rule 2 burned in my skull, don't. But curiosity isn't a choice in a place like this. It's a hunger the forest feeds until you either swallow it or it swallows you. My lips moved without consent, humming the song again, but this time the forest sang with me, a dozen voices clapping on the wrong beat, mocking me from every tree. I stepped back, iron raised, salt ready, and whispered to the dark, "If you want me, come and take me." And for the first time that night, the forest answered with honesty, a roar so sharp and high it felt like glass shattering in my teeth, followed by the unescapable sound of claws sinking into bark, climbing fast, and I knew the horror wasn't content to circle anymore, it was about to descend. The roar faded into the trees like thunder swallowed by distance, and for a long moment I stood there, gripping iron in one hand and salt in the other, whispering the dog song under my breath like a prayer stitched together from childhood, waiting for the next lunge, the next howl. But what came instead was worse. Silence, followed by geometry. The kind of geometry that doesn't belong in a forest. Because just ahead in a clearing, the rain seemed to bend around something that wasn't supposed to be there. And as I stepped closer, I saw it clearly. A freestanding doorframe, weather-beaten wood scarred with black scorch marks curling into figure eights, the handle a polished brass knob, too new, too clean, gleaming in defiance of the storm. And I felt every instinct in me rise and protest because I knew what this meant. Rule 5. If you find a doorframe standing alone, walk around it clockwise once and never step through, because time here keeps receipts and debt collectors love when you wander into their offices uninvited. Still, standing in front of it, I understood the real trap wasn't the threshold. It was the curiosity chewing through me like termites in bone. My shadow stretched toward the frame on its own, sliding across the mud like an eager child sprinting ahead of me, and I had to slam my iron spike into the earth to anchor it back at my feet, the pulse so sharp it left me dizzy. "Not today," I hissed, sweat mixing with rain, as my knees buckled slightly. I stepped wide and began the circle, clockwise, counting each step slow and deliberate. On the first step, the rain muted. On the third, the smell of pine rotted away into cheap motel soap, the same scent I remembered from a job years ago that ended in a blood-soaked hallway. On the fifth, I heard a radio crackle from beyond the door, Leah's voice faintly laughing, except Leah had never once laughed on calms with me, and the familiarity of it scraped something raw inside me. By the sixth step, the ground beneath me felt thinner, hollow like a crawl space, and from the hatch of the world below came a dragging sh sound, the same sound I'd heard under cabins before. My mouth went dry, but I forced myself through the seventh step, and as I did, the doorframe shuddered, opening inward on its own, releasing a gust of air that wasn't tonight's storm, but some other storm from some other year, and the smell of wet ash poured out. My hand tightened on the salt pouch, and for a moment I thought about testing it. Just one toe across the threshold, just enough to see what waited on the other side. But I knew the forest wanted that for me more than anything, wanted me to write myself out of my own timeline and into its. Instead, I dropped a mirror shard against the jamb, angled so that if anything tried to step through, it would have to look at itself first, and whispered, "Ledger's closed." The frame groaned, almost disappointed, and the cheap motel soap smell retreated, replaced once more by rain and pine. But my shadow hadn't moved back to my feet. It lingered, pressed against the base of the doorframe like a child sulking. And I realized with a jolt that Rule 7 was already bleeding into the night, that if dawn came and my shadow was still disobedient, I'd wake without it. "Stay with me," I ordered. And for the first time, I wondered if shadows could refuse. Behind me, the forest shifted, branches cracking in a rhythm too deliberate to be wind, and the circle I'd carved around the doorframe lit faintly as though the woods themselves were smiling at my restraint. I didn't smile back. I finished the circle, iron spike in hand, and whispered, "If you want me, you'll have to wait for dawn." But the truth scraped my spine like a blade. Dawn was still hours away, and this forest wasn't patient. It was hungry.
Leah's voice cracked over the radio again, thin beneath the static, and for the first time since entering Sheffield Preserve, I felt the smallest flicker of relief that someone else's words still existed in the world besides mine, though in a place like this, even that could be a trick. "Gallagher, report," she said, firm and clipped. And I told her about the lantern man, the mirror snare, the door frame that shouldn't exist, keeping my voice level even as my eyes never left the shadow still pressed stubbornly against that warped frame, like it had ideas of its own. There was a pause, then a soft curse muttered in German that made me believe her a little more because only real people cuss like that when they realize the job's gone sideways. "You need to know something," she added, quieter now. "Deputy Marsh didn't stumble in here by chance. He chased a dog." My breath caught, because the forest loves irony, loves reusing pieces of your heart to build its bait. "Describe it," I said, bracing myself. "Shepherd mix, big, limping. Tag said WOLF in block letters." The words hit like cold water down my spine, a cruel echo of the song I carried in my bones. "Copy," I muttered, though the forest seemed to hum louder around me, as though delighted by my recognition. Ahead, through the drizzle, I caught sight of another doorframe, not wood this time, but air itself, cut into a perfect rectangle, edges shimmering like heat rising off asphalt. Beyond it, the trail sloped deeper, darker, into a night that didn't belong to tonight. "He forgot a rule. That's why you're here." Her words dug under my skin, because hunters don't get called for messes unless the mess involves rules, and breaking rules in this forest is like giving it permission to carve your name into its ledger. The rain slackened suddenly, quiet as if the forest itself leaned closer to hear what I'd do next. I tightened my grip on the iron, shifted the salt to my palm, and took one deliberate step toward the shimmer, humming again, the childish song rasping in my throat. Offbeat clap slapped against wet air. That's when I heard it, the same tune hummed back, but in a younger voice, soft, uncertain, coming from just off to my right. I froze, iron raised, every part of me burning to turn, to see who or what sang with me. But Rule 2 whispered in my head, cold and sharp. "Don't look too soon." My salt pouch rattled, my shadow tugged at me like a leash straining toward the shimmer, and I realized with a sick certainty that the forest wasn't just testing me anymore, it was inviting me to fail. "If you're Marsh," I said, into the wet dark, "finish the verse." For a heartbeat, the humming stopped, then resumed in a new key, richer, more complex, almost beautiful in a way that hurt, and I knew instantly it wasn't him, because the forest only gets better at being you once it's already eaten the real version. I took 3 steps back, threw a chalk sigil into the mud, and drew a quick circle with the iron spike. Standing inside it as the humming closed in around me, multiplying, turning into a chorus of my own childhood voice echoing back at me from the trees. Leah's voice flared again through the calm, urgent now. "Gallagher, thermal says it's on top of you." I didn't answer, didn't dare break concentration because the shadows around me were shifting like 100 children circling, their mouths open but their eyes hollow. My song cracked, faltered, and the forest laughed with my own voice, my own rhythm, perfect now, flawless where mine was weak. I stood in the salt circle and whispered to myself, "This isn't a hunt anymore.
It's a negotiation. And the worst part was, the forest already knew it had the upper hand. The first time you hear your own name in this forest, it comes as a whisper in the wind, a trick that gnaws at your nerves but leaves you just enough doubt to wonder if you imagined it. But the second time, when it comes clear, deliberate, dripping with the cadence of voices you once loved, you know without question that you've been noticed by a collector, and collectors don't knock unless they already hold your debt in their hands. Ryan. The voice breathed from behind me, and it was wrong in the most dangerous way. Not monstrous, not guttural, but perfect. A blend of my father's tone calling me in for dinner and my mother's scolding lilt when I tracked mud through the kitchen. A hybrid of Holmes sharpened into a weapon, and every instinct screamed at me to turn, to confirm the familiarity, but Rule 6 burned like fire under my ribs. When you hear your name spoken from behind, face it with a mirror first. My hand shook as I pulled the cracked silver compact from my coat pocket. The glass veined through the middle like lightning frozen in sand, and I raised it over my shoulder, not daring to look directly. What I saw in the reflection was worse than any brute beast I've hunted. A man in a ranger's coat, brimmed hat low, lantern hanging at his side, but the smile that stretched across his face never touched the reflection, the glass version standing solemn and still while the real one beamed, and that discrepancy was all the proof I needed. I whispered the apology, my voice raw, for what I owe the dead for borrowing their steps. My free hand dug into my pack, tearing out a strip of gauze already stained with blood from my palm, and I pressed it against the bark of a nearby tree as offering. The figure in the glass tilted his head, lantern flames swelling, and spoke with a voice that wrapped around my bones. He forgot a rule. My mouth dried instantly. Which? I asked. The reflection's smile widened into something jagged, unnatural. The secret one. Collectors love riddles, love dangling the bait of forbidden knowledge, and I hated myself for leaning in, for letting curiosity gnaw, but the forest had written me into this game the moment I stepped past the boundary marker. I only have 7, I forced out, keeping the mirror steady. That's the problem, it murmured, raising the lantern until the flame became a coin of light that seared through the reflection, painting the ranger coat in fire. You haven't written yours yet. My pulse thundered, and for one reckless second I almost turned, almost looked the thing in its stolen eyes, but the iron spike in my hand reminded me what restraint felt like. Behind me the forest shifted, the air bending with a weight but pressed on my chest like water, and Leah's voice cracked through the calm, ragged. Thermals flaring, something's right on you. I dropped the mirror to the mud, and in that instant a hand slithered from the reflection seam, pale, stretched too thin, fingers jointed in too many places, reaching for the nape of my neck like it already owned me. Snarling, I drove the iron spike backward through the apparition's wrist, the impact vibrating at my arm as if I'd nailed shadow to timber. The air screamed, a hiss like rain striking hot metal, and the hand recoiled, snuffing back into the mirror as the glass warped, cracked wider, and then collapsed inward, sucking the rest of the figure in with it, until all that was left was the taste of copper and nettles on my tongue. The forest sighed, pleased and unsatisfied all at once, and my reflection, in the remaining shard, blinked out of sync with me before going still. My legs felt like water, my lungs like fire, but I straightened, salt pouch still clutched in my right hand, and whispered into the dripping silence, "Debt postponed isn't debt forgiven." The trees creaked in answer, and for the first time tonight, I wondered if this hunt wasn't just about surviving, but about righting the missing rule the forest was demanding from me.
Most hunters die by accident, stumbling across a rule they didn't know existed or forgetting one they'd recited so often it dulled into routine, but I've learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to do the opposite, to break a rule on purpose, to throw the forest a bone so it lunges for the distraction instead of your throat. And as I stood in the dripping silence after the collector folded back into the glass, I knew that was my only play left. Rule 2 had saved me twice tonight. Don't look at lantern light until you've counted to 13. But now I needed to see what happened when I cut the count short, because the forest thrives on rhythm, and breaking rhythm draws it out into the open. I slung the salt pouch to my hip, iron spike gripped tight in my fist, and followed the muddy trail until the glow appeared again, steady and warm between the trees, lantern light swaying like it had been waiting for me. My mouth went dry, but I forced myself forward, counting 1, 2, 3, and on 3 I snapped my eyes up, locking onto the flame. The effect was instant.
The warmth vanished, the light inverted into a glare so white it blinded me, burning the outline of the forest into negative shadows. And in that flash, a shape leapt forward, tall and hunched, mouth slit peeling wide to reveal those grinding horseflet teeth. I swung the iron up in reflex, and the spike connected with something solid, the impact jarring through my arm, and the thing screamed, a noise like radio static tearing through metal. My ears rang, but I pressed forward, shoving the salt pouch into the jagged seam of its mouth, dumping a fistful straight into the grinding teeth. It convulsed, body spasming as if it were trying to shake itself free of its own skin, shrinking into a man shape that almost looked human, almost begged me to believe it was. "Ryan, this isn't your hunt." "Every hunt is mine," I spat, forcing the spike forward, and I dragged the thrashing thing toward the memory of the first doorframe, the one I'd circled and warded earlier. The air grew thick and foul as I hauled it, its body buckling, folding, trying to slip out of my grip like water through fingers, but the iron bit deep, anchoring it. The doorframe loomed ahead, silent now, its brass handle gleaming in mockery, and I knew this was the place to test whether rules could be bent without breaking. I angled the creature toward the frame, never stepping through myself, and the moment its body neared the threshold, the door groaned, the grain of the wood darkening as if scorched from within. The creature shrieked, twisting violently, refusing the threshold like oil refusing water, and then with one last convulsion it sloughed free of my spike and skittered into the ferns, vanishing into the storm-drenched dark. I let it go, not because I wanted to, but because predators that flee in panic make louder mistakes later. And the forest has always taught me patience. My arms trembled, sweat stinging my cuts, and the lantern light winked out completely, leaving me with nothing but rain and the pounding of my own blood. Behind me, the right-hand path rustled, a litter of damp feathers rising in a windless draft, as though the forest had already prepared the next trap. I straightened, iron heavy at my side, and whispered the rules again, my voice hoarse. Rule 1, hum a childhood song. Rule 2, count to 13. Rule 3, balance iron and salt. Rule 4, never name an animal early. Rule 5, never step through the doorframe. Rule 6, face collectors with mirrors. Rule 7, never call for a missing shadow. And then softly, like a prayer I wasn't ready to believe, I added, Rule 8, you choose the rule to break, not the forest. The trees bent inward, listening, curious, and for the first time tonight I felt something shift in my favor. Not safety, never safety, but curiosity, hungry and dangerous, redirected away from me.
Feathers aren't supposed to lie still in rain, but the ones littering the right-hand path clung to the mud as if pinned there by something unseen, each quill pointing forward like an arrowhead, leading me into a part of the preserve I hadn't charted on any map. And though every instinct screamed that this was bait, curiosity dragged me forward because in this forest, curiosity is both compass and curse. I crouched and touched one feather, half expecting it to dissolve into mush beneath my fingers, but instead it pulsed once, warm, faint like a heartbeat, and my stomach tightened because nothing in this place should beat except me. I pressed on, iron spike loose in my grip, salt pouch ready in my other hand, whispering the song under my breath, clapping off beat to stitch a rhythm around me like armor. But the forest stayed quiet, listening, waiting for me to break. After 100 paces, the ground softened, not with water, but with hollow resonance, and when I stomped lightly, the earth beneath me thudded like wood, like a crawl space stretched under the trail, and that was when I heard it. Shh, 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 the unmistakable drag of something massive sliding along just beneath my boots. My skin prickled and I scanned the tree line until I saw it, a cellar-style hatch built into the trunk of a fallen log, rusted hook latch bending outward under pressure from below. The thing in the crawl space was trying to push its way out. I hammered my boot down hard on the hatch, iron spike raised, and the wood bucked once, twice, the thuds echoing up my legs until my bones hummed. I grabbed the nails I'd salvaged earlier, bent and corroded, and with my knife handle I pounded 2 straight through the hasp into the frame, pinning it shut even as the hatch jerked beneath me. Company, I whispered, more to calm myself than anything, because speaking aloud reminded the forest I was still choosing to narrate my own steps. Then came a sound I wasn't prepared for. Tapping. Not claws, not scraping, but a pattern. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. Hesitant, uneven, like someone trying to remember a rhythm. My chest went cold. I knelt and pressed my ear to the hatch. The tapping continued, then faltered, then resumed, sinking slowly with the beat of my humming tune. Marsh? I tried, voice low. The wood vibrated with a sob, small and muffled. I can't, a voice choked from below, thin, stretched. Can't what? I pressed. Silence, then, can't say my name. If I do, I'll be two. My throat tightened. Doubles, paper thin at first, then thickening until the forest decides which one to keep. Then tell me the secret rule, I demanded, my palm pressed against the wood, my reflection in a puddle nearby warping with every syllable. A pause, then the sobbing voice whispered, "Don't bring your loneliness, it eats with you." My stomach dropped, the hatch twitched again, desperate, but the nails held. I laid a chalk sigil on the log above, a wide smile to eat echoes, and pressed a copper coin into the groove between planks, leaving it as offering. For later, I told the unseen thing below, even as I knew I wasn't sure if I'd meant marsh or the forest itself. The scraping stopped, the tapping stilled, only the rain remained, steady and cold, and when I finally stepped back, the feathers on the trail ahead rose in a gust that didn't touch my skin, drifting into the air like a cloud of ash. My shadow leaned forward as though ready to follow, eager, disobedient, and I clenched my jaw, whispering Rule 7 under my breath, "Don't call for it, don't acknowledge it," and kept walking as the forest's crawlspace heartbeat faded beneath me.
The forest funneled me toward the lake the way a throat funnels breath, every tree leaning just enough to suggest a corridor, every feather drifting to earth behind me as if erasing the path back. And by the time the tree line broke, I was already braced for the side of it. The black dish of water stretched wide under a sky that had gone the color of wet stone, fog hugging the surface like an animal crouched low, waiting. I stepped onto the slick bank and froze, because the reflection in the water showed me only in pieces. My boots and legs in one ripple, my shoulders in another, my face faint and wavering, but never the whole of me at once. And when I glanced down at the mud around my boots, I realized why. My shadow was gone. Rule 7 thundered in my head. If dawn comes and your shadow is missing, don't call for it because the forest will think you're lonely and send company. And for the first time in years, a pulse of fear so sharp it felt like betrayal spiked through me. I gripped the iron spike tighter, salt pouch digging into my palm, whispering the rules aloud again like rosary beads, but the forest didn't give them back to me in echo. It just let the silence stretch, daring me to break it with the wrong words. On the far shore, the thing stepped into view, tall and long-limbed, smooth face split by that jagged mouth, but this time it carried something worse than claws or teeth. It carried my silhouette draped over its shoulders like a cloak. It tilted its head, watching me, and then, in a voice perfectly tuned to mine, it began to hum the dog song, clapping on the offbeat exactly where I always had, and the sound twisted my stomach, because it wasn't mocking anymore, it was perfecting. "You brought your loneliness," it crooned, voice echoing across the water, "and the forest eats with you." Fog swirled upward, knitting into the outline of a freestanding doorframe, only this one shimmered like heat off asphalt, edges warping with colors that didn't belong to this world. I clenched my jaw because I understood now. The rules weren't finished. 7 were given, but an 8th waited to be written, one that only I could carve. My hand found the pen tucked into my pack, ink smeared damp from the rain, and on the crumpled paper where the 7 rules already bled, I scrawled, Rule 8, when the forest offers company, answer with work, because work costs and the forest respects cost. My throat burned as I read it aloud, the words heavy as iron in my mouth, and as if acknowledging the price, I drew a circle of chalk sigils around me, each one hissing as the damp ate into them. "You want me?" I told the figure across the lake. "Earn me." It tilted its head again, that wide mouth pulling back in a grin that didn't reach where eyes should have been, and the fog door swelled brighter, opening wider, the scent of motel soap and cheap coffee gusting out. My missing shadow twitched, pulling like a leash toward the threshold, but I held it down with the iron spike, pain spiking up my arm as if I'd driven the nail through myself. The forest shuddered, every tree groaning in chorus, as if the very act of me writing my own rule had cracked its rhythm. "You wrote it wrong. You don't get to write." "I just did," I hissed back, and the circle of chalk flared bright around me, burning against the dark like teeth bared. For a moment, the lake itself seemed to hold its breath,
Fog frozen, water still, and in that stillness, I understood. This was no longer about surviving the night. This was about convincing the forest that I belonged in its ledger as something other than prey.
The circle hissed under my boots like a living thing, each chalk sigil glowing faintly as the storm's weight pressed harder on my shoulders, and across the black sheet of water, the figure wearing my shadow finally stepped forward, one long limb at a time, as though gravity bent differently for it. The lake didn't ripple where its feet touched, the fog parted willingly, and when it reached the shoreline, it tilted its faceless head at me, mouth slit splitting wider in a grin that wasn't hunger, but recognition. "Ryan," it said in my voice, not mocking, not wrong, exact. And the sound turned something deep in me because it wasn't pretending anymore, it was offering. Behind it, the fog door yawned wide, wicking ramels of soap, copper, and rotted wood, and for one terrible second I felt the pull like an ache in my bones, the promise of no more loneliness, no more debts, no more nights where only the rules kept me company. My shadow twisted violently beneath the iron spike, desperate to sprint across the threshold, and pain shot up my arm like lightning as if the forest itself was reminding me that I couldn't hold it forever. I steadied my breath, clutched the salt pouch tighter, and spoke aloud the new rule I'd written, every syllable an anchor. Rule 8. When the forest offers company, answer with work, because work costs and the forest respects cost. The thing stopped, that grin faltering just a fraction, and I knew hesitation when I saw it. I drove the iron spike deeper into the mud, sparks flashing where metal met unseen resistance, then tore the salt pouch wide open and flung its contents into the air, the grains catching the wind and swirling into the chalk circle like a miniature storm. The forest screamed, not with sound, but with pressure, every tree groaning, every drop of rain freezing mid-air before slamming to the ground at once. The figure lunged then, impossibly fast, closing the gap in a blur of pale limbs and grinding teeth. But I was ready. I swung the iron spike up in both hands, driving it forward as it collided with the edge of my salt and chalk circle. The impact was like two storms colliding, air exploding outward, ground buckling, my ears filling with static. Its mouth split wide enough to swallow my face, but the salt storm whipped into the seam, hissing, burning, and the chalk symbols flared so bright I saw the bones of my hands through my skin. "This ledger is mine," I roared, and for the first time all night, the forest actually hesitated, because defiance isn't what it expects, submission is. The figure screamed in my voice, in Marsh's, in Leah's, in 100 tones of people I'd never met, but who had probably been here before me. And then it staggered back, clutching the cloak of my shadow, trying to drag it away as payment. I didn't think. I leapt forward, ripping my own shadow free with the iron spike, pain searing the white hot through my chest as if I'd torn a rib out. But when it snapped back beneath my boots, the circle steadied, sealed, and the fog door behind the thing imploded like glass under pressure. It reeled, shrieking, stumbling into the lake where it dissolved not into water, but into steam, rising in a column that whirled upward until dawn finally bled across the tree line, the first light of morning breaking through the storm clouds and painting everything in gray-blue. I collapsed to my knees, salt burning in my lungs, chalk dust stinging my eyes, my shadow trembling beneath me but present, whole. And when I finally looked up, the forest was still. No more humming, no more whispers, just trees swaying gently in a real wind for the first time that night. My radio crackled, Leah's voice exhausted, real. "Gallagher, you alive?" I pressed the button with a shaking hand, staring at the lake's calm surface where nothing but my own reflection looked back. "Ledgers closed," I rasped. She said nothing for a long beat, then simply, "Copy." I hauled myself upright, every muscle aching, and as I limped back toward the trail, I whispered the rules again. All 8 this time, the 8th scratched in like a scar. Because in Sheffield Preserve, you don't leave with victories, you leave with costs. And the forest never forgets who dared to write in its book.
And that's where I'll leave you, for now. The forest ledger is closed, for tonight at least. But rules like these don't vanish. They wait. If you ever find yourself under those trees, humming a song you thought only you remembered, count carefully, because the forests will be counting too.
If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe to Echoes After Midnight for more tales of the strange, the dark, and the unexplainable. New stories come every week, so stay curious, stay cautious, and whatever you do, never break the rules.